Aloha in a very Hawaiian way. Good morning. I hope you guys recovered from last night. It's always a tough job the day after the conference dinner. I really enjoyed it. And first of all, my warm thanks to Wayne for inviting me. I've been trying to hook up with him for a while. And I'm really glad that I could come along for such an exciting event. And also intellectually, I think, thanks to Wayne for I didn't notice it on all the communication, but yesterday when I entered to put the ethnographic in the title in parentheses and qualified, and I think it's a crucial move because some of the museum spaces, settings, and situation we try to understand might not be ethnographic at all. And that's why I need to take the liberty to disagree with Johannes Fabian and his point yesterday on the creepy plural as a conceptual disease. I see, as Wayne now sees the moment of the plural, as a conceptual liberation or salvage, and take it with Vieras de Castro, that the main job of the anthropologist is not to explain the other, as it has been attempted over century, but to multiply the self through the other. And that brings me to a last just framing point, that I find it intriguing that we haven't heard the term cross-cultural at all yesterday, neither as an observed reality nor as a conceptual analytical lens. And I find it intriguing because to me, museums are inevitably radically cross-cultural spaces. And all of us, or most of us, do profoundly cross-cultural work. So I hope that I can make a modest, which is Wayne's last name, contribution to this line of thinking. And I will talk about plurality, so my talk will be super creepy maybe, but I still invite you to just embark on it. Does that work? Yeah. Shortly after I began fieldwork aimed at studying Indigenous curatorial practices at Bishop Museum, Hawaii last year, it struck me, and I can still remember how it riskily did so, that in Hawaiian and other Polynesian languages there exist no words for art and artifact. Hawaiians, for example, do have words such as waiwai, which translates roughly as goods or valuables, makamai, precious, and waiwai ali'i, chiefly valuables. But do these equate to an artifact, a term which carries problematic, that is, Euro-Americentric theoretical baggage? Kamalu Dupre, assistant collection manager at Bishop Museum and my constant interlocutor throughout the research, suggests that Olelo Hawaii, or the Hawaiian language, offers with Hana no Eao Kahiko, another term that translates literally as skillfully created ancient works. Dupre's emphasizes that while these pieces of skilled work have been commonly re-identified by anthropological others as artifacts and ethnographic material culture, for Hawaiian people, they have remained imbued with mana as material manifestations of their kupuna or ancestors, or the kupuna themselves. This cultural reality is further reflected in the word mea, which can refer to both people and things, thus collapsing the common Euro-Americentric dichotomy between subject and object. At the same time, there is, according to Maile Andrade, a Hawaiian customary practitioner and scholar, no word in the Hawaiian language for art. Given the widely acknowledged skill in the creation of material culture, one might argue that the Hawaiian world is imbued with beauty and artistry in every facet of life, and not as something aestheticized out and separated from function, as through the imposition of alien categories such as, again, art and artifact. Andrade offers an exit strategy out of this anthropological impasse by understanding art as a visual conversation or language to express, which, as she insists, unfolds as a mana conversation. How then do these indigenous conceptualizations embedded in the Hawaiian world drive curatorial practices at Bishop Museum? This question becomes quite delicate if we consider that the position of the curator was disestablished in the 1990s in the wake of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, due to its association with scientific colonization and as a reflection of bishops shifting focus from scientific to public institution. However, as a panel discussion on indigenous curatorial practices, natives in non-native spaces, which included Māori and Hawaiian cultural practitioners and scholars as well as myself, indicated Hawaiian museum professionals still undertake curatorial tasks if these are understood in the original sense of the word deriving from curare and meaning to care for something and to heal. How then can Hawaiian material ontologies, the plural, concepts and caring practices, again plural, travel and speak back to so-called ethnographic museums in Europe? To address these vital questions and conduct serious cross-cultural study between oceanic and European worlds, it seemed to me that I have to dig deeper into the notion of conversation as mana conversation. Importantly, I followed this route without launching another futile attempt at linguistically translating mana, a Polynesian concept that has defied foreign categorization and exceeds common translations as power, prestige, authority, and others. Rather, I was eager to translate empirically how mana is lived, performed, and experienced and gains meaning by the person experiencing it, and what this interpretive performative va, or space between, tells us about the relationship between Hawaiian people and their material manifestations. I asked Kamalu Dupre and Marcus Hanalei Marsan, cultural resource specialist at Bishop Museum, to have a conversation with a museum piece of their choice and allow me to become part of it. Anthropological inquiry, conceptualized as such cross-cultural mediation and translation, I would argue, channels rather than represents the agency of others, and is not content with generating ethnographic evidence for preconceived ideas, such as art or artifact, but allows different worlds to dictate the terms of their own analysis, while recursively reframing its own point of departure, such as, once again, art and artifact. Those slides are quite full, and I know that, but I'm always working hard to humanize the so-called ethnographic by giving it concrete faces and stories. So I just put there, I just have 2 slides, and I will also read it out. So again, from a design perspective, it might be overwhelming. From a research perspective, it's totally crucial, because I don't explain those guys. The photo on the top depicts a makaloa mat, woven by an 80-year-old woman, Kalakamalino, from the island of Kauai, and represented to King Kalakau in 1874, with an inscribed petition asking the Heavenly One to lift the burden of the newly introduced animal tax at the time of dramatic change for the Hawaiian people. This remarkable woven protest, which has been hardly discussed in the ethnographic literature, despite being held at Bishop Museum for over a century, speaks to Marcus as he describes, and I'm reading out. This particular mat is unique in that it has a text written over its entire surface. The letters as well as the lines are all overlaid onto the surface of the mat, which means it can't be seen on the backside. I think the special way that this particular weaver chose to express herself was in a very Hawaiian type of way. She chose to honor the king with the presentation of a makaloa mat. Makaloa was probably one of the finest gifts that could be offered to a chief during this time period. Kalakamalino, the weaver of this mat, was probably one of the last master weavers of makaloa. Marcus goes on to elaborate how Kalakamalino's chosen and distinctively Hawaiian manner to express herself and address an issue inspired him to weave the piece depicted on the photo on the bottom, on the left. He incorporated the petition's final words, Naunakala, which he interprets as, let forgiveness resound. And I quote him, to always be a symbol of or a reminder that there are things that we all must do for the betterment of ourselves or our family or our situations that might not be always easy. And if we look at that and just remember what it is intended for, there's a greater purpose for it rather than just the immediate gratification. But the betterment for future generations, future decision making, those ideas need to be remembered. And that's how I interpret this wonderful mat that we see here in front of us. So this up there. In the artwork that I created that speaks to the mat very closely because I used the same lettering style. So it's a double conversation. The pieces speak to each other and speak to curator and to curator through the original producer. So it's a multi-layered conversation materialized. It becomes apparent that both material expressions are neither artifacts nor do they represent external realities. Rather, both function as vessels through which Marcus and Kalakamalino converse through the language of weaving and the actment of cultural skills, thereby mobilizing underlying Hawaiian purposes and values for moral and political ends. It becomes equally apparent that the term art has certainly entered Hawaiian vocabulary, but is either reframed, for example, as creative expression, in a conscious effort to resist conceptual colonization, or understood differently. In the case under scrutiny, art corresponds to a materialized dialogue which speaks, in Marcus' words, to the evolutionary continuity of culture in a sense of the past as kawamamua, or the time in front, which firmly grounds a Hawaiian person in the present, with the eyes fixed upon the knowledge of the past and the back facing the unknown future. So there is no literal translation in Hawaiian for past. While no two pieces of any form of creative expression are the same, as Marcus asserts, and will never have the same mana, because every person is different, it is, according to him, still of vital importance to have a strong understanding of why those are made, so you can create new things with the same ideology and concept, and it's crucial, which will look completely different, but will be telling the same story. Throughout this dialogical process, the conversation between cultural practitioner, both past and present, through material languages and the translational power of skills, informs curatorial conversations of care, as Marcus further explains, and I quote him. I take that perspective away from these treasures we care for in the museum, and I transform that into my own art of today. I try and understand the practices of our ancestors and the reasons why they did certain things. So Marcus always stresses the why. If we can keep that strong, that will be the foundation for future generation. That's how I look at my artwork. I try to maintain the understanding. The understanding can take completely different forms today, and that's why my artwork kind of speaks to that in different regards. This conceptual conversation between Marcus and Kalakamalino appears to offer a glimpse into Hawaiianness, or the Hawaiian heart, that continues to beat despite the overwhelming impact of US-American intellectual occupation and cultural colonization. Deja Brown argues in a similar way that, and I quote, while European influence has changed Pacifica art aesthetically, it has not changed it conceptually, and that's key. Bishop Museum thus emerges as a living resource rather than a static record which is actively used by indigenous actors to self-theorize, self-historicize, and self-interpret, to rediscover indigenous skills in their own right, without necessarily aiming at indigenizing Western practices, sciences, and institutions, as related research has shown. So the picture in the middle is not indigenizing the West. The picture in the middle is a profoundly indigenous situation, I would argue. Being a cultural practitioner, Marcus looks at and approaches the Makalu met with a different eye, as Meile put it, and remains in the special human condition of being engaged in a continual dialogue with materials, both physically and imaginatively. And being a Hawaiian cultural practitioner, the act of curating or caring for the Makalu met becomes an act of mana, which is, according to Tai Tawika Tengan, a Hawaiian anthropologist, about making those connections between people and their material manifestations, both past and present, and about activating them. While Marcus' chosen piece appeared quite organically in our own conversation while he showed me around the collection store, to Kamalu it amounted to a difficult decision to settle on one piece, since according to her, they all speak to me, so it comes up all the time that things speak, because they are people. There's something inside of me, my ancestors, my own being, that really corresponds to all of the pieces of kapa, whether they are from the time of Captain Cook until the time now, people making things in response to the same reason why I make it, to continue on what our ancestors have done. Making sure that everything is alive within us. We just need to enact it. It's a kind of inside here. And there are so many that were just speaking to me. I really feel like I have a connection to all of those. And these were her very first words. So right at the beginning of her interview, Kamalu seemed to offer another glimpse into a different dimension of Hawaiianness as something being experienced and becoming meaningful through Na'au. As Wilsono Hereniko argues, the place of Na'au, which Retumans, it's a small island close to Fiji, call Huga, or literally translates as inside of the body, especially of the abdomen, corresponds to a kind of knowing that cannot be explained logically or rationally. Charles Nainoa Thompson, president of the remarkable Polynesian Voyaging Society that helped reconnecting Hawaii with its Polynesian roots and was one of the driving forces behind what came to be called the Hawaiian Renaissance in the 1970s, considers Nowhow as the heart of wayfinding and as something that, from a scientific point of view, it's just unexplainable. It's something very deep that has nothing to do with intellect and everything to do with feelings. It's Nowhow, the knowledge of the heart. In the case of Kamalu, we can observe that this embodied concept or conceptual embodiment has a historical quality in which the truth of the age resides and through which the future is shaped as through the kapa or paper mulberry skirt she produced and was worn by a girl at a hula festival as seen in both photographs. So the photographs I really like because they bring in the virtual and the technological as a new layer of conversations which at the same time are totally Hawaiian. Kamalu describes, and I read out, the feeling when I saw this skirt and this person was wearing it and it was dancing in it, it totally blew my mind. The feeling I got was all is right in the world. This is how it's supposed to be. I'm getting all emotional again, and Kamalu is very emotional. My eyes are glistening. It's like living, like, oh my God, it's 2014. And this young woman of 2014 is wearing a piece of kapa that I made, doing a traditional dance, speaking to the stories of our ancestors. Cool. Technology. Kamalu is way more into technology than I am. That's for sure. Speaking the stories of where she came from, through her dance, through the way she's dressed, and I was part of that and I helped. When she was dancing, she was there. It wasn't just, oh, I have a skirt on, I'm doing a performance. She was being it, she was manifesting it. I could feel that when I saw her and I'm like, I'm part of that. So-called ethnographic exhibitions have often portrayed native and tribal peoples as distant in time and place, as over there and back then. Hawaiian's own conception of the past, as reflected in Kamalu's materialized conversation with both ancestors and contemporaries, however, figured it as a dynamic ontological source which is continually recycled to ground the speaker on the present, geared towards the future. A temporal ontological reality of a past being present, being future. Dipesh Chakrabarty, in his efforts to provincialize Eurocentric history through subaltern past, lends support to such an assertion by arguing that, and I quote him, pasts are in taste, in practices of embodiment, in the cultural training the senses have received over generations. This is how the archaic comes into the modern, not as a remnant of another time, but as something constitutive of the present. Whatever the nature of these pasts that already are, they are always oriented to futures that also already are. While Chakrabarty importantly alludes to the partly unconscious temporalities of cultural practices, which one sometimes does not even know one engages in, Kamalu highlights the conscious dimension of a past being present, being future, since according to her, you're constantly negotiating past identities with present identities. The key question to be addressed by Kamalu while looking after the material manifestation of this dialogue at Bishop Museum then becomes, how can I show this thing respect that it's not just a thing? The times we live in, she further asserts, releases us from certain practices, but it doesn't release me from acknowledging that history. For her, this longue durée of cultural significance is immutable and plays into her care of those material manifestations of people. To conclude, perfect timing. The collaborative research at Bishop Museum has begun to reveal that contemporary indigenous curatorial practices are aimed at and informed by the redevelopment of indigenous skills and the reformation of oceanic networks. These indigenous skills are culturally embedded, politically enacted, and historically orientated, and become meaningful through the personal investment of meaning. Cultural differences thus appear as variations in skill, which continuously evolve through changing materials and appearances, but remain remarkably intact conceptually. Thinking through variations in skill then facilitates an ethnographically grounded conflation of abstract dichotomies such as art versus craft, tradition versus modernity, and individual versus culture, which paralyze Western thought. Throughout these processes of redeveloping indigenous skills, objects and curatorial practices operate as ships or mobile interpretive vessels that embody and navigate the material and discursive relations across Oceania. Indigeneity, then, is not a spatial or temporal retreat to an isolated place in a nostalgic past, but appears as an articulation and performance that retransforms the post-colonial double vision into a cosmovision or cosmo-Oceania on indigenous terms. These historically informed ethnographic insights have significant implications for museums in Europe, since they indicate that Hawaiian material ontologies cannot be reduced to or equated with Euro-Americentric categories such as, again, art and artifact. Furthermore, the emerging findings call for an analytical shift from the usual museological focus on exhibitionary productions and representations towards approaching curatorship as ongoing conversations which require various common languages and the translational power of traveling skills. These empirically grounded conceptual propositions and their temporal implications are a work in progress, but let me add a bit of evolving substance. Curation understood as conversation implies co-presence and therefore contemporaneity with both ancestors and future potentialities, thus shaping a curatorial response to and engagement with the temporal continuum or past being present being future underpinning Hawaiian cultural practices. Approaching the material manifestations of these conversations as languages resonates with John Dewey's view that objects of art are expressive, they are language, rather they are many languages, so again the plural. Such a perspective expands the depth and breadth of language by including thing languages, which enable communication with and between things that are both material and conceptual, and by seeing language evocatively rather than through a structural or representational lens, thus opening the limiting equation of culture or action with text to the performative effect and embodied effect of human expressions in their material dimensions. The notion of skill corresponds with recent calls to shift the analytical focus from material objects as finished products to the processes through which they are produced. My conceptualization suggested here, however, moves beyond an understanding of skill as an epistemological compass towards approaching it as a cultural performance, political action, and historical force through which material languages become configured and temporal conversations become facilitated. Indigenous skills thus operate as a mode of communing and cosmovisioning and underpin curatorial practices aimed not at its explanation, but its catalyzation. These empirically grounded conceptual propositions also serve to contribute to and reframe broader academic debates. Oceanic historicities or negotiations of the past are profoundly performative and resist conventional Euro-Americentric conceptions of history as linear, progressive, or teleological. The temporal continuum of a past being present being future proposed here resonates, for example, with Epeli Hau'ofa's notion of the spiral, which connotes both cyclical and linear movements. Furthermore, the longue durée of Hawaiian philosophies, concepts, and practices, as well as their embodied manifestations, as through Nowhow, calls our attention to the reawakening, or ho'alahau, of temporarily dormant cultural facets instead of their renaissance or rebirth, which by definition implies their former death that evidently did not occur. Allowing indigenous concepts such as Nowhow to dictate the terms of their own analysis also enables us to rethink indigeneity in the 21st century. Various scholars have rightfully insisted that place-bound indigeneity and diaspora, especially in the Pacific, cannot be regarded as oppositions, but need to be considered in dialectical, productive tension, and as contemporary manifestations of the longue durée of transoceanic voyaging and settling. I want to suggest another layer through which indigeneity becomes performed, through the performative dialectic between concept and body, or between embodied concept and conceptual embodiment. I close by returning to the museum, an institution that has been widely regarded as being born out of European enlightenment and modernity, both temporal or epochal concepts with, once again, highly problematic Eurocentric theoretical baggage. In the case of Bishop Museum, however, the seemingly externally imposed civilizing tool has always had a profoundly cross-culturally constituted quality. I therefore want to broadly suggest that there is no such thing as Western modernity, if misunderstood as a sovereign and autonomous Western-bound achievement. Even laudable perspectives on the indigenization of modernity, and multiple modernities seem to suggest, at least at the level of conceptual semantics, either a chronological precedence of a singular bounded Western modernity which is subsequently indigenized as a response to externally imposed forces, or a multiple co-modernity consisting of separate strands developing in parallel. Instead, I argue that modernity itself has been internally multiple and radically cross-cultural throughout. And if the past was different than we thought, then, by definition, the present is different than we think. And if we accept that histories are made, then they can be made, unmade and remade. The future, then, is forever up for grabs. Mahalo.